I often say no member state is innocent when it comes to Palestine. Well, a big exception now for South Africa. The rest is the same story. Israel calls its targets human shields or collateral damage. Israel calls hospitals military bases. Israel defines most of what constitutes civilian objects under international law as a military target, either destroyable or, in any case, targetable. And this is the genocidal logic. But you cannot say that all the neighborhoods living around the Hamas combatant is human shields. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. And the crazy thing, is that I've seen serious lawyers, serious legal scholars, hair splitting this argument, as Israel was saying, well, but the attack was proportionate. I've said over and over that the ICC, the legitimacy of the ICC needs Palestine almost more than Palestine needs the ICC. But you know what gives me hope in this grim scenario, in this grim landscape, are the young generations. I mean, I call them watermelon revolution because this is what they are to me. I mean, they have built a space of consciousness and awakening.
This is Musa Qureshi from the Watermelon Reports. We have with us today Francesca Albanese. She doesn't really need any introduction, but for those of you who don't know, she is the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Palestine. She has expertise in the area of public international law. She holds degrees from the University of Pisa and the University of London. And in addition to that, she has co-authored the definitive text on legal rights for Palestinian refugees, published by Oxford University Press. That has over 600 pages. So she really does know what she's talking about, and we're incredibly pleased to have her with us today on the Watermelon Reports. Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd like to start by understanding, before we talk about what's been happening in Gaza recently, by understanding what the reality is of the occupation of Palestinian territories for Palestinians. And I'd like to actually turn it around and actually look at it from the Israeli perspective. So we know that Israel was created as a safe haven for Jewish people who had suffered in the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust. And since 1950, there's been a law of return in Israel, which has allowed any Jewish person anywhere in the world to claim Israeli citizenship. And since 1967, we know that some of these new Israeli citizens have actually moved into Israeli settlements on the West Bank or into houses in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. So if I am a Jewish person living in London or New York, and I decide, whatever, it's always raining in England, property prices are going up, I want to live in the West Bank, in a settlement. What's wrong with that? And what can a Palestinian family do if I decide to move onto their land?
This option is wrong because it's illegal and it's immoral. It's illegal because Article 49 of the Geneva Convention, of the Fourth Geneva Convention, prohibits basically the creation of urban settlement populated by citizens of the occupying power in the occupied territory. This is a war crime, a severe, grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which also causes individual liability for those who architect this system. So it cannot be done. There is a right of self-determination of the Palestinian people who has been infringed upon for decades and continues to be. So yes, I understand your point on in 1947-49, the situation was very different for the Jewish people and they had nowhere else where they would feel safe. I take this point, although nothing prescribed that it had to happen at the expense of the Palestinians, meaning expelling hundreds of thousands of them and dispossessing them and making them refugee for over seven decades. But all the more today, I mean, the scenario you are talking about, it's very likely of people wanting to move to the West Bank because it's more convenient. Again, it's illegal and it's also immoral because it's happening at the expense of another people's right to live and exist on that land.
You're obviously an expert in the area of international law, so that's your legal opinion on what's allowed under international law. In terms of fast forwarding really to October the 7th, October the 7th was a horrific day, I think we can all agree. But it's important to understand it in the context of Palestine's occupation, because the occupation of Palestine has legal effects under international law. What I'm trying to understand is what happened on October the 7th, the actions of Hamas. Were they war crimes? Were they an act of legitimate resistance to occupation, which we know that the United Charters allows? I mean, what were they legally allowed? What were they legally allowed to do? And does Israel have a right to defend itself against these sort of actions?
No, first of all, let me push back on what you concluded before. I mean, it's not my opinion. The right of self-determination is an inalienable right of the Palestinian people, and what I just said has been recognized by the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly and International Court of Justice. So the occupation has no right to crush the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people, and this is the law, and it's not an opinion. Now, going back to the 7th of October, your second question, there is no possibility, in my view, to define the killing of civilians, the brutalization of civilians, and the targeting of civilians as legitimate resistance. Resistance is legitimate, but it has limits, and it cannot turn into violence or acts of terror against the civilian population. Whatever the qualification in the eye of the perpetrator is, whether the Israelis have or not the right to be there, they are civilians unless they are soldiers in active, in duty, and so in active combat. And this applies, it's important to stick to this rigor of international law, because this is a way to protect both Israeli civilians and Palestinian civilians. So I have the same approach when I say also Hamas fighters, whomever they are, can only be targeted while in combat. So they cannot be assumed. You cannot presume that someone is a Hamas affiliate and therefore deserves to die, which is what's happening in the Gaza Strip. So yes, there is no question that Israel had the right to protect itself, its territory, and its citizens on the 7th of October. So repel the attack and arrest whomever was on the territory committing crimes. At the same time, what was necessary is to have investigations and prosecutions, which is not what has happened. What has happened has been an assault, a military assault of unprecedented violence, which cannot be justified as self-defense. I understand that the hostages had to be liberated, but how, 7 months after this violence, how has the life of the hostages been made safer by this assault? In fact, rumors are that a number of them have died out of deprivation, starvation, and the conditions of the assault. So the measures allowed by international law to Israel would have been of another nature.
I think very few people will be able to argue with that. Just going into a little bit more detail about what's happening with the hostages. So Israel and its allies seem to have drawn a sort of moral equivalence between the hostages and the devastation happening in Gaza, in the sense that, when opponents of what's happening in Gaza at the moment have said, well, 15,000 children have been killed. The response is, well, you have to free the hostages, otherwise we'll just keep going and just keep causing devastation in Gaza. This is just a simple yes and no question to start with. Do you accept that Hamas has committed war crimes by taking Israeli hostages?
Yes.
Okay.
If it's a yes and no question, yes.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. So that's a clear, unequivocal yes. So talking about hostages, what do you say about the Palestinian hostages? So what I mean by that is that Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch have documented for a number of years about children being kidnapped by Israeli forces, held in detention, sometimes signing confessions in Hebrew, with their families not being informed, sometimes not having legal counsel. How do you characterize that? And in addition, there have been stories since this conflict began about healthcare workers in Gaza being kidnapped by the Israeli forces. What is the view of international law of these actions?
Most Palestinians detained by Israel are detained arbitrarily. And this is something that I put a significant effort on since the beginning of my mandate. Just for the audience who's listening to us and might not be familiar with my work, but my second report was about arbitrary deprivation of liberty, where I was looking at the conditions. I mean, how come almost 1 million Palestinians, those before the 7th of October, had been arrested and detained, many of them children, tens of thousands of children are arrested in less than a decade. How come? And I've explained how the system is made to confine the Palestinians physically, psychologically, professionally, in the space that is left to them, and then deprivation of liberty becomes a condition of life. So I'm fully familiar with this file, and of course I've advocated for the liberation of the Palestinians arbitrarily detained for almost 2 years now. So I'm absolutely on the side of the argument you were making. The fact that they are not qualified as hostages is because of technicalities, because Israel, being the occupying power, has the power to carry out arrest and detention, thing that Hamas in Israel or elsewhere doesn't have. I mean, in Israel, because in Hamas, in Gaza, it has this power. But again, this is just terminology, because de facto these people are arbitrarily deprived of their freedom, and this conduct, which is systematic and widespread of Israel, can also amount to a crime against humanity. And this was before the 7th of October. Of course, the situation has worsened, has aggravated itself after the 7th of October.
So I just want to be clear on what you're saying here. Are you saying, when you talk about arbitrary detention, are you saying that Israeli forces can take a Palestinian child and put them in jail, and there is no judicial process to see whether that child is guilty of any crime?
This is what happens. I mean, you can be arrested and detained without judgment, without trial, without charge. There are thousands of Palestinians detained arbitrarily. This is what I mean. There is no system. And also, if you think that the Palestinians have to go through military courts, there is no judicial system that is not military under Israeli occupation for the Palestinians. Well, if you are from Gaza, then it's another category that has been created, unlawful combatants, which is nonsense. But the Palestinians in the West Bank, including children, are held responsible for breach of military orders written by soldiers, enforced by soldiers, reviewed by soldiers in military courts. And you can be sent to jail, technically, forever as a Palestinian.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Special Rapporteur. I'm still a little bit dismayed by this. So, for instance, the UK Foreign Secretary recently has been tweeting quite a lot about the Israelis hostages, and of course, their rights need to be upheld. But this has been going on for years. What has the international community done about this? About the problem of Israeli forces keeping Palestinian children in jail without a judicial process?
Musa, I can tell you, I'm as shocked and revolted as you and many others with us, because everyone knows what is the system that Palestinians have been subjected to for decades. In 2013, UNICEF issued a report that was discussing all what we are saying, only through the prism of children, and nothing has been done. No one has been there to effectively protect the Palestinians. for decades. So I'm not justifying the forms of reaction that the Palestinians have, but they have been left on their own with the frustration and the sense of despair mounting, with the illegality after illegality being condoned, not just by the United States and the West, but frankly, everyone. I often say no member state is innocent when it comes to Palestine. Well, a big exception now for South Africa. The rest is the same story.
All right. Well, that's a very bleak picture you've painted. Just talking a little bit more about the international community. So the UN Security Council has, in the last few weeks, passed a resolution for the first time, which has decoupled Israel's siege and devastation of Gaza from the hostage question and has demanded that Israel stop what it's doing in Gaza. And we know that you've mentioned South Africa. The ICJ is considering allegations of genocide against Israel. But laws, I mean, you're a lawyer. You know that laws are not self-operative. They need a mechanism for enforcement. So what are the mechanisms for enforcing United Nations Security Council resolutions? And for instance, let's say the ICJ says genocide is happening. What happens next?
Look, there are a few things that are 100% clear and sure. The UN Security Council resolutions are binding. The ICJ decisions are binding. And so the preliminary measures that have been ordered to Israel in order not to commit acts that could amount to genocide. The moment the international community evades its responsibility, the moment each member state, because you know the Genocide Convention creates obligation for each member state to prevent and punish the crime of genocide, so to investigate and not to commit any act that could be seen as complicity with genocide. Everyone is responsible. So potentially there are legal proceedings that can be initiated in those states that have partaken in the commission of genocide, for example, by selling arms, by creating that political shelter that makes any action to enforce legality impenetrable, not enforceable. And you're right, it's true. International law is as strong as the will of states to respect it and to enforce it. But as I often say, the law without politics is ineffective, but the politics that accept to run against the law, they risk to be criminal. And this is what we are facing today. And it's the full erosion of the system, which is there to protect all of us. It's either universal or it won't work.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying, and I understand as somebody who works as a United Nations Special Rapporteur and as somebody who obviously works in the legal field, you believe in the law. But I really do wonder, honestly, do you think that there ever has been an international rules-based order, or do you think that essentially the world is being run in the geopolitical interests of the great powers of the world?
But you know, Musa, it feels very weird to be, and I'm not against you, of course, to be taken as an idealist for stating the law. But would you tell a lawyer at the national level, oh, but, you know, do you really believe in the law? Of course I believe in the law, because this is the outcome of a social contract, of an agreement. The fact, as I said, that there continues to be lack of compliance is at the same time both a problem and a symptom of a problem. There is an arrogance, a hubris among certain countries that they can run the international system as they want. They have even coined the new expression rules-based order. Whose rules? What rules? This is not the system. The system that was born out of the ashes of the Second World War was supposed to work in a given way, and they are dismantling it. They are dismembering it. Piece after piece. So I'm there as a Cassandra saying, look, this is going to happen. This is the only thing that has prevented us from really falling apart as international society. And this is what protects us from brutal force. But it works only if everyone respects it. And surely impunity doesn't become systemic and widespread. And we are already there. I'm cognizant, but again, it's not my fault.
Okay, so let's move on now and let's talk about your document, The Anatomy of Genocide. It's a very evocative and controversial title. I'm a doctor, you're a lawyer, so let's dissect this document. You say something very interesting near the beginning of this document on page 3. You say, quote, "Genocidal intent and practices are integral to the ideology and processes of settler colonialism, as the experience of Native Americans in the United States, First Nations in Australia, or Herero in Namibia illustrates," unquote. So my question is, if you think genocide is integral to settler colonialism, and Israel is at its heart a settler colonial project from the start, from 1948, are you saying that Israel is intrinsically genocidal?
I don't think that you can have a yes and no question on that, because the quote you gave me, you shared, it's taken from an historical section where I say exactly what you said. You quoted me correctly. But it also says that genocide is a process and it's not an act. So genocide as it was conceived by the scholar, the Jewish scholar who coined that term, Raphael Lemkin, genocide is the destruction of a people. And it's not just the physical act of killing, it's the destruction of a society, its political relations, its economic reality, its institutions. And this happens gradually. So in that sense, any settler colonial regime has a dormant gene of extreme violence that can unleash against the colonized population when the settler group feels threatened. And this is the history of settler colonialism and colonialism in general. So going back to this, yes, I realized while writing this report and studying genocide literature that this was expected, that we could have understood where it was heading. But of course, there is also so much ignorance around what genocide means. There is so much amnesia about the colonial history and what the Western countries have done to most of the world, that there is little appreciation for this, the depth and the gravity of that sentence that you quoted. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean that Israel wanted to kill all Palestinians if they left on their own accord. Because for me, the end goal is ethnic cleansing, claiming as much land as possible. And this can happen without one person being killed. But still, it would be complete erasure of Palestinian presence from their homeland, or what remains of their homeland for those who live in the occupied Palestinian territory. Is it genocidal? Yes, of course it is.
Let's move on and talk more about the document. Again, early on in your document, you assert, and I'm quoting again, quote, "Genocide cannot be justified under any circumstances, including purported self-defense," unquote. So let's accept that premise for a moment, that the world has accepted that there are no circumstances. You cannot say I'm committing genocide because I'm defending myself. Now, obviously, Israel isn't saying that it's committing genocide in order to defend itself. What it's saying is, we're not intending to commit genocide. We're just defending ourselves, and people are dying, innocent people. We accept as a result. How do you counter that argument?
That this is the logic Israel is using is humanitarian camouflage. This is what I've said in the report. Israel has never denied to have killed tens of thousands of people, to have orphaned and maimed tens of thousands of children, to have destroyed all universities and schools and most of the hospital infrastructure and 70% of the housing infrastructure. Israel doesn't deny that, doesn't deny the fact. What it changes in Israel's narrative is the qualification. Israel calls It targets human shields or collateral damage. Israel calls hospitals military bases. Israel defines most of what constitutes civilian objects under international law as a military target, either destroyable or, in any case, targetable. And this is the genocidal logic. I mean, this is what has upheld this operation since the very beginning, crushing meaning and substance of the basic tenets of international humanitarian law, which are the principle of distinction between civilian and military objects and individuals engaged in combat. The principle of proportionality. Every military action needs to be proportionate to a given military objective and do not translate into excessive damage for the civilians. 70% of the population has steadily been, victims of this assault has steadily been women and children. 70% of those who have been killed are women and children. This is not collateral damage. This is, and the creations of conditional life that would lead to the destruction of the people. This is something, a genocidal act that has the intent in itself, because it's clear that if you cut water, food lines, and medications and fuel for months, it's clear that you lead these people to die. This is the genocidal logic that is behind this military assault.
So despite what you've said about the Israeli government's intent, we know that intention is the most difficult part of proving an allegation of genocide. Your analysis, The Anatomy of Genocide, provides several quotes asserting intent by Israel's leaders. And I'd just like to examine those quotes in more detail. So you've quoted Isaac Herzog. He's the president of Israel. He's the equivalent of King Charles in the United Kingdom. He doesn't have any command authority. You've quoted Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, who's referred to human animals, but it's not clear when I listen to his quote whether he's referring to all of Palestinians in general as human animals, or was he referring only to Hamas? And you've also quoted the Israeli Minister of Heritage, Amihai Eliyahu, who provided evidence of intent because he advocated nuclear bombing of Gaza. But we know that as soon as he said that, his statement was immediately denounced by the Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he was suspended. So how do any of these quotes prove the intention of the Israeli government?
Well, first of all, I made it very clear in the report that for me, the gist of proving intent was not even in statements. And because if you look at the jurisprudence of international tribunals who have dealt with the case of genocide, the statement is not sufficient per se. The statement infers, they are an important element, but they must be supported by the reality on the ground and the capacity to commit genocide. It's not saying horrible things per se. Although there is a database that has been collected, and because of the word limit of my report, I couldn't give more room to any of those, but I took the statements that I found examining the video evidence that has been produced by soldiers themselves, and I have verified, triangulated with former soldiers or with Israeli and Palestinian lawyers to test the veridicity, etc. For me, the gist of it is what troops on the ground have done, absorbing, internalizing those orders. Because, human animals, they could have said it of Hamas. First of all, such derogatory language is not helpful and is not acceptable, because you couldn't qualify as human animals the IDF so that the IDF can be targeted wherever they are, combat or non-combat situation. So it would have been problematic no matter what. But it was a dehumanizing language which resonates with how Palestinians are commonly depicted in Israeli societies. And in fact, it has reverberated across the conducts of soldiers. Soldiers have been referring to Palestinians as animals, and these scenes have been captured by cameras while they were destroying Palestinian homes, violating the intimacy of Palestinian homes or Palestinian bodies. They've been treated like animals, like subhumans. So there has been no empathy whatsoever. And even the Amalek language, destroy everyone and everything, the adults and even the suckling, this is what has happened. I mean, there have been soldiers boasting about the fact that they had killed a 12-year-old girl because there were no other younger children around the area. So there are hundreds of these videos available, and I'm sure that many of them are already filed with the ICC and other tribunals, hopefully. So the question is there.
Yeah, that's a convincing and powerful response. I'd like to just, for the last few minutes of this interview, I want to go through some of the principles of international law, just so our viewers can understand. You have mentioned them briefly, but I'd like to go through them in more detail. So on page 18 of your document, The Anatomy of Genocide, I'm again quoting here, quote, "The attack on the Jabalia refugee camp killed at least 126 civilians, including 69 children, and injured a further 280. Israeli military personnel affirmed that the target was one Hamas commander in an underground base," unquote. So I think that speaks to the principle of proportionality in international humanitarian law. Can you explain legally for our viewers what international humanitarian law says about proportionality and distinction in self-defense, and why you think Israel has breached those principles?
So international law is very clear about the principle of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in military action, regardless of whether the military action is an act of aggression or it's self-defense. There are certain, in any case, certain rules have to be observed, full stop, also because it's jus cogens in international law. So it cannot be derogated ever. The principle of distinction means that only soldiers or only combatants in active combat can be targeted, only if someone is involved in a military operation. So a soldier who's taking a rest with his family cannot be targeted, and same with other forms of combatants. All the more, those who are in the inner circle or in the entourage of the combatant or the soldiers cannot be targeted. Civilians have to be spared, but even a combatant who's been injured or wounded cannot be targeted by extreme action, needs to be treated humanely. And you see, all this is gone. So the principle of distinction between military and civilian objectives. Civilian objectives and civilians must be spared unless they become involved into a military action. In case, for example, of human shields, which is something that Israel invokes all over, say that Hamas protects itself behind the Palestinians as human shields. This has never been proven, and it cannot be used as a blanket argument. It is to be proven per each attack that the people who have been killed could not be avoided because they were used by human shields. But you cannot say that all the neighborhoods living around the Hamas combatant is human shields. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. And the crazy thing, is that I've seen serious lawyers, serious legal scholars, her splitting this argument as Israel was saying, well, but the attack was proportionate. And there were people who were really debating about how many dozens people can be killed for an attack to be considered proportionate. No, the attack shouldn't have been launched full stop if the target was one person whom Israel has to prove was in active combat, and which has caused the death of dozens and killing of hundreds. Of course, this is not even recklessness. This is calculated killing. It's a potential extermination, conscious extermination. And there is the other element of proportionality. What is proportional in an assault that clearly has the potential to kill dozens and injure many more? Of course, to kill one person again, and Israel had to prove that that person was in active combat. Of course, it's not proportionate. And what are the precautions that were taken to ensure that civilians would be spared by the hostilities? None. And this is why there is no question whatsoever that this was intentional conduct aiming to create also deterrence, because Israel has been using this logic of spreading terror among the civilians in Gaza so that they could revolt against Hamas. I think it's called the Dahia Doctrine, and was also used in Lebanon.
That's really interesting. I have to say that what really, firstly, I accept I've got some experience with lawyers, and lawyers do tend to hair split and do tend to argue about the letter of the law, forgetting perhaps the spirit of the law. What for me really sets apart your analysis is that you dissect what you say is Israel's manipulation and distortion of international humanitarian law. And for instance, the human shield argument, essentially, it looks like Israel is essentially converting the entire Palestinian population into either a legitimate target or a collateral damage, and as you say in your document, therefore making the whole of the Palestinian population killable or destroyable. What does this do to international law if this is allowed? For instance, I don't think Russia, for instance, in its assault on Ukraine, has not designated the entire Ukrainian population as legitimate targets or part of the supportive structure of legitimate targets. What would be the effect of allowing this to go ahead?
Yeah, first of all, this creates on top of being genocidal, in my assessment, and others are joining this analysis as the time passes, because this analysis has provided a lens to analyze what's happening. So more and more pieces of evidence are coming as pieces of a puzzle and give sense to the overall picture. And there are two things that are happening. One is that an entire civilian population is being, quote unquote, as I say in my reports, de-civilianized, meaning deprived of their civilian status, that of protections through norms and mechanisms that differentiate them from everything is targetable, everything is killable. So this is gone. The nuances around what is a civilian and what he or she needs to be protected is gone. And this is a very negative precedent, because it can happen again, and there is a precedent that has already been, been condoned by a large number of member states in the international community. The other connected risk with this full erosion of the respect of international law is that this way of conducting hostilities against an entire population, which is framed as hostile, and also recurring to random means of identification of targets, including artificial intelligence, paved the way of another kind of conduct of hostilities that can easily become proportionate genocide. This is the concept that is being sort of tolerated here with great impunity, and I fear it might become a new method of engagement in conflicts.
Proportionate genocide, that sounds like a chilling terminology. My final question for you is about the ICC. you may have sensed from this interview that I'm quite frustrated. I think a lot of people are frustrated by international law, because I think the key problem is that, for instance, if I break the law in the United Kingdom, there's a British police force who can arrest me and prosecute me for my crime. And there doesn't seem to be an international police force that can enforce international law. So Israel can effectively do what it likes, and the great powers can effectively do what they like. The ICC seems to have got Netanyahu worried recently. There's been several pronouncements about, for instance, withdrawing funding from the Palestinian Authority if the ICC takes action against Israel. And I think one of the key things about the ICC is that, for instance, the ICC is part of British law. If the ICC issues an arrest warrant, then British police are obligated to arrest that person if they enter British territory. So we know mass graves have been uncovered recently at Al-Shifa Hospital. We've seen more and more evidence of war crimes. What are the implications of ICC action, and how is it different from anything else that's come before?
It's not that it's different from what has come before. Is that finally something moves. I've said over and over that the ICC and the legitimacy of the ICC needs Palestine almost more than Palestine needs the ICC, in the sense that so much was at stake with these war crimes being committed over and over. Think of the settlements. I mean, I don't understand why there hadn't been arrest warrants issued before. I mean, even after February 2023, when there was a clear annexation process sanctioned at the Israeli government level, and nothing moved. So there has been such a delay in delivering a modicum, a minimum of justice to the Palestinians, that has been detrimental for the Israelis as well, because then we cannot be so naive to believe that there is no connection between the extremism of the current Israeli government, which unfortunately reverberates across a certain portion of the Israeli society. We cannot believe that there is no direct connection between these and what Israel has been permitted to do by means of humiliating and forcing into indignity an entire people for decades. You know, this hubris is producing what Daniel Levy calls the boomerang effect of colonization. So what is to expect is that once the arrest warrants are out there, they are given effect to. So there should be, as you were saying, in every country which is a member to the Rome Statute, it should be given effect. And of course, the fear is that countries will find the remedies that make the path to justice even more torturous and more difficult. It wouldn't be the first time. But you know what gives me hope in this grim scenario, in this grim landscape, are the young generations. I mean, I call them watermelon revolution because this is what they are to me. I mean, they have built a space of consciousness and awakening within the restriction that has been left. Again, not the flag, but still the watermelon. It's still Palestine, said in another form, and in a form that is much smarter than how previous generations, in my view, have articulated, because they also know they need to be peaceful. They need not to react to provocations. These young people are so smart, and they are leading the way. So this is their society eventually. I mean, it's their world, and it's only fair that they decide that they stand out against justice, because I mean we have not been effective enough in making sure that a better world and a more just world materialized. So the challenge is with them now.
Yeah. So you've made a very important statement there, that the ICC needs Palestine more than Palestine needs the ICC. And as you've said, that if those in power do not provide justice, then those in power will be bypassed. And that's probably what's happening with the watermelon revolution that you just mentioned, the very significant protests that, again, have got Netanyahu quite worried that are happening in university campuses across the United States. Special Rapporteur, I've asked you some very difficult, challenging questions today. Thank you for your robust and very forthright answers. We're very grateful for this interview. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and till the next one.